When the factory closed, the town fell silent. The whistle that had marked every morning for decades stayed still, and the air felt heavier, as if even the wind didn't know where to go. The place that had once been full of clanging metal and voices shouting over machines was now just brick and dust, holding its breath. Michael Hanlon was one of the last to leave. For 24 years, he had swept those floors, polished the hallways, and locked the doors long after everyone else had gone home. He was the janitor, but he'd always felt like part of the heartbeat of the place. That night, when the last shift ended and the final lights flickered, he stayed behind. Not because he had to, but because someone should. The locker room smelled different now, not of sweat and oil, but of rust, paper, and silence. Most lockers stood open, their doors hanging like tired arms. A few remained shut, their padlocks still fastened, left behind by men who'd probably moved on years ago. Michael walked slowly, brushing his hand along the cold metal, each locker like a memory waiting to be touched. He stopped at one near the end of the row. The label had faded, but he could still make out the name, Pierce, W. The lock was old, rusted, and hanging loose. It gave way easily. Inside sat a metal lunch pail, dented, scratched, and worn smooth from years of use. It wasn't special, not at first glance. Just another relic from a time when a man's lunch was packed before dawn and eaten by the hum of machinery. But when Michael picked it up, it felt heavier than it should. He sat on the bench and opened it carefully. The hinges creaked. Inside was a small thermos, a folded napkin, and a black and white photograph. A woman and two children, the kind of family photo taken in front of a porch, with the sunlight catching faces just right. On the back, written in pencil, it said, "To Daddy, don't be late. Love." Michael held the picture for a long time. The corners were soft, worn down by years of opening and closing. Beneath it, a time card stub was tucked under a rubber band, Pierce, W, and a small, flattened coin. And then, at the very bottom, folded neatly, was a short note, "Back by 11:45. Save me a place, Walt." The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind that belonged to someone who didn't write much, but wanted to be sure it was read. Michael leaned back against the cold locker. He didn't know who Walt Pierce was, but something about that note, the casual promise of return, made him uneasy. Most men who worked here left traces, names on clipboards, signatures on safety logs, photos pinned to boards. But Pierce's name didn't ring a bell. He carried the pail to the office, where a single light still hummed above a desk. The room looked frozen in time. Calendars stuck on March, chairs half-turned, coffee cups abandoned mid-sip. He set the lunchbox down and began to search through old folders stacked in drawers. Most were brittle, labels peeling off, smelling faintly of ink and time. He finally found one that matched. Pierce, Walter, hired 1974. Fabrication. There was no termination date, no relocation form, just a short note scribbled in red ink. No call. No show, April 2nd, 1985. Michael frowned. That was nearly 40 years ago, and the lunchbox had been here, sealed and untouched, ever since. He looked again at the photograph, at the woman's patient smile, at the boy's messy hair. How many times had someone waited for Walt to come home? How many nights did they set the table for one more plate? Outside, the evening rain began to fall, tapping softly on the factory windows. The sound filled the empty building, echoing in a rhythm that reminded him of the machines. Steady, deliberate, alive. He turned off the lights, but before leaving, he placed the lunch pail gently under his arm. He couldn't explain why. It just didn't feel right to leave it behind. Driving home, the pail sat on the passenger seat, its latch trembling with every bump in the road. At a red light, he glanced at it and said quietly, "We'll find out where you belong." He brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and opened it one more time. The photo caught the glow of the lamp, that same soft light that turns nostalgia into something sacred. He poured out the old coffee grounds from the thermos, washed it clean, and laid everything neatly on the tablecloth. Somewhere in this town, he thought, someone must remember Walt Pierce. Maybe a son. Maybe the woman in the photo, if she was still alive. maybe no one at all. But the feeling wouldn't he let go that this wasn't just a forgotten lunchbox. It was a message left waiting too long. He folded the napkin back around the photograph, placed the note on top, and closed the lid. The latch clicked softly, like the sound of something unfinished being promised another chance. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that last line, back by 11:45. He wondered if maybe, after all these years, it was time someone finally saved Walt's place. The next morning, Michael sat at his kitchen table with the lunch pail open before him. The smell of coffee drifted through the house, and the morning light spilled across the metal lid, glinting off the worn handle. He stared at the photograph again, the woman's gentle smile, the little boy's untamed hair, and felt something in his chest tighten. He wasn't a man given to sentimental quests. He'd swept the factory floors for most of his life, raised 2 kids, and buried a wife. His world had always been simple. You work, you come home, you do your best. But now, with the factory gone and silence filling every corner of town, this lunch pail had become the only thing that still felt unfinished. He decided to start at the Union Hall. The building sat across from the shuttered plant, its flag faded, its wooden steps creaking with memory. Inside, the air smelled of dust and stale coffee. A woman behind the counter, maybe in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a bun, looked up from her paperwork. "Morning," Michael said, setting the lunch pail gently on the counter. "You ever hear of a man named Walt Pierce? Worked fabrication, in 70s, maybe early 80s. The woman squinted. Pierce. She chewed the name like it tasted familiar. Walt. Yeah. He was quiet. Always had a sandwich and an apple for lunch. Why do you ask? Michael flipped open the latch and showed her the photo. Found this in his locker when they closed the plant. Thought maybe someone ought to have it. The woman's expression softened. That's his wife, Maggie. She used to bring the kids by on Fridays. There was talk when he disappeared. People said he'd gone off looking for work in another state. Others said he just walked away. She sighed. That was a long time ago, honey. Do you know if she's still around? Not sure, she said. You might try the old records office, or the church up on Harrison. They keep directories going back decades. Michael thanked her and left with a small knot in his stomach. As he drove, the streets looked both familiar and strange, houses sagging with time, front porches empty where laughter used to be. The town was shrinking, not from distance, but from forgetting. At the records office, a young clerk helped him search through the dusty drawers. They found a listing: Pierce, Walter and Margaret, 314 Willow Lane. The address was still local, though the file hadn't been updated in years. That afternoon, Will drove there. The house was small, painted white once, but now faded to the color of paper left in sunlight. A chain-link fence leaned forward, and roses, brittle and untrimmed, climbed along the porch railing. He knocked twice. No answer. A neighbor watering her lawn across the street waved. Looking for Maggie? She called. Yes, ma'am. Does she still live here? The woman shook her head. She passed about 3 years back. Her daughter lives in Topeka, I think. Came down to clear the place, but no one's been here since. Michael felt something shift, not disappointment, exactly, but a weight of quiet realization. He thanked the neighbor and walked back to his car. He stood for a while, staring at the front steps. A faded doormat still read "Welcome Home." He sat in the car and opened the Pail again, as if the photo might say something new now. The faces inside smiled as gently as ever, untouched by time or truth. He thought of how many mornings Walt might have carried this pail, filled it with Maggie's sandwiches, her small notes folded beside an apple. Every man had a rhythm: coffee poured, door closed, shift started. But what had stopped his? That evening, went through old newspaper clippings at the library. The young librarian, a quiet man with kind eyes, helped him scroll through microfilm reels. Hours passed, and then there it was. Local worker missing from Hanford plant, April 3, 1985. The article was short, just a few sentences. Walter Pierce, 41, of Willow Lane, was reported missing after failing to return home from work. Authorities believe he may have left town seeking employment. His wife, Margaret, stated that no note was found. He was last seen carrying his metal lunch pail, read that line twice. Last seen carrying his metal lunch pail. He sat back, staring at the grainy text on the glowing screen. The pail that now sat on his kitchen table had waited nearly 40 years to be opened. He left the library as the sun dipped low behind the old mill towers. The air smelled of rain and iron. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Someone, maybe that daughter in Topeka, deserved to see what was inside. At home, he wiped down the pail again, polishing the dull metal until it caught the light. He placed the photo and the note back inside, then paused. The words, "back by 11:45, seemed different now. Less casual, more like a promise that had never been kept. He set the lid back in place and closed it carefully, the click of the latch echoing softly through the quiet kitchen. Outside, the night settled over the town, gentle and still. Michael turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching the factory's shadow in the distance. For the first time in years, he felt like he had something to finish, not work, not duty, but a story that still needed its ending. He didn't know yet what he'd find, only that some things, once lost, don't stay that way forever. Michael woke early the next morning, long before the sun had reached the horizon. The metal lunch pail sat on his kitchen table like it had something left to say. He poured himself coffee and read the note again, tracing each letter as if touch might unlock time. Back by 11:45. Save me a place, Walt. He wasn't sure what he expected to find in Topeka, but something told him that the pail had waited too long to be silent any longer. He packed a small bag, tucked the photograph and the folded note back inside, and set off down the highway. The drive took 2 hours. He passed golden fields and long stretches of fence line, the kind that seemed to go on forever without ever really beginning. The radio played soft country songs full of lost love and open roads, and somehow they fit the mood. In Topeka, he found the address in the city directory, Pierce, L. Maple Avenue. The house was neat, white siding and a wide porch, wind chimes swaying gently. A woman in her 40s stepped out to shake a rug, her movements slow, measured. Michael stopped at the curb, nervous for the first time in years. "Excuse me," he said, stepping closer. "Are you Linda Pierce?" She turned, wary but polite. "Yes. Can I help you? My name's Michael Hanlon. I worked at the Hanford plant, back in Kansas City." He hesitated, then lifted the lunch pail from his bag. "I found this in a locker. It belonged to your father." For a moment, she just stared. Her eyes went to the pail, then back to him. "My father?" she repeated quietly. "That can't be. He disappeared in 1985. We never found out what happened." Michael nodded. "I know. I found his things when they shut down the plant. Thought maybe you'd want to see." She reached out, hands trembling slightly, and touched the metal as if afraid it might vanish. "He carried this every day," she said. "Mom used to pack his lunch before sunrise. She'd hum when she did it, said it kept her heart from worrying." Michael opened the lid slowly. Inside lay the photograph, the coin, and the folded note. Linda picked up the photo and let out a soft breath. "That was our front porch. I must have been 6. She traced the pencil writing on the back. She wrote that the morning he left. She read the note next, eyes lingering on the simple words. "Back by 11:45. Save me a place." Her voice faltered. "He never made it home. The police said maybe he left on purpose. Maybe he couldn't handle the layoffs. But Mom never believed that." Michael shook his head. "Neither do I. He left his lunch sitting right there in the locker, like he meant to come back." Everything about it felt unfinished. Linda looked down, her eyes filling. "When I was a kid, I used to wait on the porch every night. Mom would tell me stories until the streetlights came on, and then she'd whisper, 'Maybe tomorrow.' She kept saying that for years, even after she got sick." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of wind chimes again. It filled the quiet between them. "I didn't think anything of his old job for a long time," she said softly. "But every time I smelled coffee, it reminded me of him. He always carried that thermos. I can still hear the sound it made when he set it down on the counter." Michael smiled faintly. "I found it inside. Still smelled like coffee after all these years." Linda laughed through tears. "He wouldn't go anywhere without it." She closed the lunch pail carefully, both hands holding it like a fragile thing. "I can't believe you brought this. After all this time." He nodded. "Some things wait to be found." They sat on the porch a while longer, the afternoon sun softening. She told him stories about Walt teaching her to ride her bike, about the way he used to whistle the same tune every morning when he left for work. There was no bitterness in her voice now, only a quiet peace, like someone finally exhaled after holding their breath for 40 years. Before leaving, Al asked, "Would you want to keep it?" She hesitated, then smiled. "No, I think it waited for you for a reason. Maybe you were meant to carry it a little longer." He started to protest, but she shook her head. "Dad believed things find the right hands when they need to. If he left it behind, maybe it's because someone like you would know what to do with it." He looked at the pail again, the scratches, the dents, the marks of years. "Maybe," he said quietly. When he drove back home that evening, the sunset spilled gold across the fields. The lunch pail sat beside him on the passenger seat again, same as before, but it felt different now, not just a relic, but something alive, like it had carried a voice all this time, whispering across years for someone to listen. He reached out and tapped the lid gently. "You made it home," he said. And though the car was silent, he could almost swear he heard an answer, the faintest hum, like the sound of work continuing somewhere beyond the reach of time. The next morning, the sky was a soft gray, the kind that made the world feel unhurried. Michael sat on his porch, the lunch pail beside him, warm coffee in hand. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the wall clock. He had hardly slept, his mind circling the same question over and over. What now? He thought about Linda, about her steady voice when she said maybe the lunch pail had waited for him for a reason. He'd seen something in her eyes that reminded him of his own daughter, that same mixture of strength and tenderness that life teaches only to those who've carried loss for too long. He lifted the lid once more. The photograph lay there, the edges curling slightly, the pencil words faint but still legible, "To Daddy, don't be late. Love, M." Beneath it, the note folded neatly in its place. He'd read it a dozen times, yet every time it felt different. Not a schedule, not a promise, but a man's quiet assurance that he would return, and then never did. He didn't know how to bring closure to a life that ended without an ending. Maybe you couldn't. Maybe all you could do was make sure the story wasn't forgotten. By afternoon, he was back at the old factory. The gate still stood open, the padlocks hanging like relics of routine. The wind had carried dust across the lot, leaving faint footprints of the past on every surface. He walked inside, down the same hallways he'd swept for decades, until he reached the locker room. The air was cooler there, still heavy with the scent of iron and memory. He stopped where locker 87 once stood. Pierce, W. The number plate was gone now, but he remembered the spot by heart. He set the lunch pail down on the bench, its metal softly touching the wood. He took out the photograph and placed it inside the locker's shadow, where sunlight from the window fell in a thin beam. Then he unfolded the note one last time, smoothing it flat with his hand. The ink had begun to fade, but the words still held their shape. He read them quietly under his breath. "Back by 11:45. Save me a place." He set the note on top of the photograph, then closed the lid of the pail and let the latch fall shut. The sound echoed faintly through the empty room. It was such a small sound, yet it filled the silence in a way that felt final, like the closing of a chapter long overdue. For a while he just stood there, hands in his pockets, letting the quiet settle. Through the high windows he could see the late afternoon light bending over the old machines and tools, all frozen mid-story. The world had moved on, but this room, this tiny corner of time, still remembered. Before leaving, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small piece of paper. On it, he wrote, "Found and remembered. For Walter Pierce and those who worked beside him." He taped it gently to the locker door. When he stepped outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain again. He looked back once, then turned toward the river. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant peace rather than emptiness. Driving home, he didn't turn on the radio. The road rolled by, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered silver under the fading light. At one point, he caught himself smiling, not because anything had been solved, but because something small and human had been restored. That evening, he poured himself another cup of coffee and sat by the window, the way he imagined Walt might have after a long shift. Outside, the streetlights blinked on one by one, the world tucking itself in. He thought about all the things people leave behind. Lunch pails, photographs, unfinished notes. Sometimes they aren't signs of forgetting, he realized. Sometimes they're invitations for someone else to remember. And maybe that's what this was all along, not about finding answers, but about keeping memory alive, passing it forward so it wouldn't fade. He raised his mug slightly, as if to someone unseen, and said quietly, "You're home now, Walt." Then he sat back, closed his eyes, and listened to the soft ticking of the clock. For the first time in years, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded right, steady, patient, alive. Because in that moment, Michael understood, some returns don't happen on time, but they do happen. Some stories remind us that even the smallest memories deserve to be found again. If this one touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep the quiet stories of ordinary lives from being forgotten.